Hello there, how are you tonight? In the quiet folds of time, beneath the heavy hush of snow-choked mountains and the slow creak of ice-kissed trees, life unfolded in the Viking Age, like a woolen sock unraveling in slow motion. It was a world carved from stone, stitched with hardship, and occasionally chewed on by reindeer. The wind hummed softly through wooden longhouses, slipping between gaps in the walls like a tired ghost. Meals were mush. Conversations were muffled. Most dreams ended with someone getting frostbite. Even heroes snored in their helmets, tucked beside goats that occasionally whispered Nordic lullabies. There were no galloping romances or thundering triumphs. Here only the rhythm of chores, the soft crunch of stale bread, and the steady, sleepy narration of a skald who lost his voice to quiet despair. Life was cold. Life was hard. And above all, life was slow. So, pull your wool blanket tight, settle into your straw-filled pillow, and prepare to drift gently into the foggy fjords of historical suffering. This is the story of Viking brutality, told at the pace of a sloth who's just discovered porridge. In the quiet gloom of twilight, nestled between misty fjords and hills that always seemed slightly disappointed, a Viking longhouse yawned across the frozen earth. Its wooden walls leaned wearily inward, stitched together with old rope, moss, and a mutual agreement to not collapse. At least not today. Smoke crept lazily from the thatched roof, curling into the sky like it was tired of working and just wanted a nap. Inside, life bloomed very slowly. The hearth coughed softly. A turnip steamed in a pot as if rethinking its entire existence. Bundled in woolen cloaks and emotional fatigue, the villagers moved like overcooked porridge, thick, deliberate, and always slightly lumpy. Bjorn the elder sat near the fire, carving a spoon with the grace of a man who'd forgotten what spoons were for. His beard, full of crumbs and regret, wobbled as he hummed a lullaby passed down from his grandfather, a tune so slow that even the flames lowered their crackle to listen more sleepily. Children sprawled across straw beds, staring into the void with the kind of existential dread usually reserved for philosophers and sock merchants. Their chores were done. The fish had been unenthusiastically gutted, the goat had been unsuccessfully reasoned with, and the mud had been scraped off the floor only to return out of spite. Outside, wolves howled, distantly, not in hunger, but in shared melancholy. This was the heartbeat of Viking life. Not war, not glory, just the soft thrum of boredom in a world too cold for enthusiasm. The longhouse didn't celebrate heroism. It celebrated surviving another day with most toes intact. And as Bjorn drifted into sleep, spoon in hand, Turnip quietly judging him, the longhouse let out one final creak of approval. Tomorrow would be the same, maybe a little colder, definitely duller. The air in the Viking lands was made of ancient sighs and disapproving gusts. Each morning began with a slow negotiation between the frost and your fingers. Breathing was a commitment. Blinking, two hard wrist icicles forming on your eyelashes. Winter didn't arrive. It simply existed. Always, like an inescapable background hum that made sure no one felt too excited about anything. Rain never danced, it trudged. Wind didn't play, it interrogated your tunic and left emotional damage. And snow, oh, the snow, fell with the tenacity of unpaid taxes, quietly piling, suffocating. It crept into boots, dreams, and livestock conversations. Olga, the unshowered, once stared at a hailstorm and said, "This is the third worst thing that's happened to me today." The first two involved a spoiled goat cheese wheel and a broken comb. But still, hail had feelings. It targeted foreheads and shins with suspicious precision. Vikings didn't so much walk as they braced forward, perpetually leaning into winds that told secrets about impending misery. There were no umbrellas, just emotional resignation and cloaks woven from scratchier regrets on warmer days, which meant you could almost feel your knees. The mud returned like an annoying cousin, eager to be underfoot and inappropriately clingy. Fog, meanwhile, was the official mood of the village. It rolled in like the narrator of everyone's inner monologue, whispering doubts about goat investments and whether anyone truly enjoyed pickled fish. Even the sun, when it bothered to rise, mostly hovered just above the horizon, like it was half asleep. Its light did little except highlight the vast stretches of muir across the icy terrain. Thus, weather wasn't a passing inconvenience. It was the ambient villain in everyone's Viking narrative. Axes dulled from frost. Roosters forgot how to crow. Even the fjords sulked, still majestic, sure, but deeply unimpressed with themselves. And so, when the elders gathered to complain, which was often vaded in tea lament taxes or war, they lamented the drizzle, the dramatic drizzle that arrived like an opera performer with unresolved feelings. Sleep came easier when you gave up on warmth. That's what Viking weather taught. Life is cold, damp, and slightly itchy, and perhaps all of it is just a gentle invitation to lie down, wrap yourself in turnip-scented wool, and embrace the long nap of Scandinavian melancholy. Breakfast in the Viking Age arrived without enthusiasm. It usually involved something beige, something chewy, and something mildly suspicious. Gruel was the main staple oats, soaked in water in emotional silence. Some mornings, if luck was kind and the wind less judgmental, the gruel included a turnip shaving or a generous sprinkle of yesterday's regret. Goat milk flowed freely, but it was lukewarm and always tasted like a memory no one wanted. Cheese existed, though most of it screamed quietly when you bit into it. Vikings didn't snack, they endured food. Mealtime wasn't a celebration, it was a contractual obligation between your stomach and the tundra. Fish was the closest thing to a delicacy, if by delicacy you mean slightly less horrifying. Herring dominated every plate, every pot, and every dream. Dried, salted, smoked it, was consumed until the villagers began to resemble herring themselves, wide up, flaky, and always vaguely damp. Bjorn, the elder, once tried to introduce spiced eel to the menu. It was rejected unanimously and ceremonially buried with an awkward duh. Lunch was indistinguishable from breakfast, and dinner was just a repetition except colder, with fewer illusions of freshness. Occasionally, someone would roast a root vegetable. This caused excitement until everyone remembered root vegetables have the texture of damp wood and the flavor profile of introspection. Feasts happened. Yes, but they were rare and exhausting. After slaughtering 3 pigs, 7 chickens, and a goat with stage fright, the villagers gathered only to discover they'd forgotten to invent seasoning. The resulting stew was described by one guest as optimistically bland. There were berries in summer. They were tolerated. Mushrooms were foraged. Carefully, half were edible. Half could make you believe your goat was a philosopher. Trial and error was the Viking way. Dessert, no one knew what that was. Occasionally, honey appeared, but only if a bear had misplaced its swarm. Most sweet cravings were resolved with disappointment and a strong nap. Food in the Viking Age didn't nourish the soul. It reminded the soul to lower its expectations. Every bite echoed 1,000 winters of culinary despair, and as the villagers cleaned their wooden bowls with moss, yawning in synchronized dissatisfaction, sleep returned like a comforting fog, their stomachs full not with joy, but with responsibility. To live as a Viking was to work like the fjords were watching, silently judging your pitchfork technique and offering zero encouragement. Occupations weren't chosen. They were inherited, inflicted, or randomly assigned by goats with unsettling eye contact. The axe-wielder's woes. Raiding sounded glamorous. It wasn't. It involved rowing for 17 hours while your neighbor farted apologetically, stumbling ashore with half a boot, and shouting battle cries that sounded more like sneezes. Pillaging was awkward. You had to find things worth stealing, politely explain your intentions with swords, and later navigate a longship full of jars, goats, and accidental in. The axe itself was heavy and emotionally complicated. It never felt sharp enough. Maintenance required sitting under a cloudy sky for 3 hours rubbing stones while contemplating how deeply the blade mirrored your life choices. The farmer's eternal suffering. Farming in Viking lands was the spiritual equivalent of gardening on a frozen sponge. Crops were skeptical. Soil was haunted. Nothing grew without bribery or sacrifice. Bjorn once tried to convince a patch of barley to sprout by whispering sweet nothings. The barley refused, citing emotional boundaries. You plowed with wooden tools, pulled by horses who had existential crises midfield. Harvest was a dance of disappointment, interrupted only by the discovery of one mildly edible root and a beat that looked like it knew your secrets. The seamstress's slow defeat clothing was essential. Nudity was frowned upon in raids, so women stitched garments from wool, fur, and shredded regrets. Every thread frayed, every needle bent in protest, and goats constantly chewed on unfinished tunics, claiming it was fashion commentary. The goat tenders' trials. Goats were gods in disguise, cruel, stubborn, and prone to mid-thunderstorm. Caring for them involved feeding, avoiding their judgment, and enduring emotional manipulation. One goat named Ina ran away daily, just to be dramatically retrieved. The blacksmith's burden metalwork was crucial. Swords, nails, and combs, none of it formed willingly. You hammered, melted, and begged iron to behave. The forge roared with heat and passive aggression. Sparks flew like confetti at a bitter wedding. No job was glamorous. Every profession came with frostbite, splinters, and the deep knowledge that someone, somewhere, would probably spill goat milk on your life's work. And yet, through the blisters, the brambles, and the unbearable weight of soggy wool, Vikings endured. Not for glory, not for wealth, but because sleeping was only allowed once the goat stopped biting the ladder. Justice in the Viking age wasn't swift. It shuffled in wearing a fur cloak and sandals made of unresolved grudges. Disputes were common. Solutions were optional. The legal system was based mostly on shouting, staring, contests, and axe ownership. When a crime occurred, like goat theft or suspicious stew behavior, the village gathered around a large rock known as Judgment Boulder, which had no opinions but offered excellent acoustics for dramatic sighing. The accused stood quietly, mostly because long-winded explanations made your knees cold. The trials, if they could be called that, were conducted by the Thing, a grand assembly where elders debated by mumbling over one another and occasionally throwing mass to signal agreement. Olga the Unshowered once won a case by sneezing and looking vaguely guilty, which was interpreted as divine remorse. Trial by combat. Sometimes, for serious offenses, justice demanded trial by combat, but combat was rarely exciting. Most participants were old, emotionally compromised, and holding blunt weapons. One duel lasted for hours and ended when both combatants fell asleep mid. Other punishments included exile, not dramatic, just walking into the snow until you rethought your choices, fines, paid in goats, turnips, or sentimental rocks. Public shame mostly involved being followed by a disappointed chicken for 3 days. Feuds that felt like fog feuds between families simmered gently for generations. Overspilled ale, crooked fences, or arguments about the emotional intelligence of pigs. Retaliation was expected, but scheduling was flexible. Bjorn once swore vengeance but then forgot. Distracted by a very good-looking cloud, mediation sometimes worked. It involved sitting in silence near a bowl of soup until everyone agreed to stop complaining. The law of the goat village wisdom often deferred to the goats, who were believed to sense guilt and poor moral hygiene. If the goat stared at you too long, it was assumed you were lying. If it chewed your cloak, you were innocent but unfashionable. In the end, Viking law didn't promise justice. It offered closure. Slow, sleepy closure wrapped in ambiguous verdicts and the occasional ceremonial dance. As the villagers returned to their longhouses, yawning through consequences and misremembered laws, the sky exhaled frost. No one felt completely absolved, but they did feel slightly more tired. And in Viking society, that was enough. Viking belief didn't come with commandments. It came with weather forecasts, ravens, and a vague sense that the gods were probably watching and mildly disappointed. Odin, Thor, Freya, each had their preferences, moods, and confusing demands involving boars and mead. Worship was an ambient activity. No church bells, just murmurs, offerings, and the occasional goat sacrificed with passive-aggressive dignity. The villagers built wooden shrines that leaned sideways, decorated with animal bones and sincere confusion. The local priest, known as Elder Goose, specialized in rituals that often ended in silence. He chanted softly, then stared into the mist as if waiting for divine commentary. Once, during a rain ceremony, the only response was a sneeze from the clouds. Gods of thunder and existential fog, Odin demanded wisdom, but most villagers had a limited supply. Thor favored bravery, so they offered him socks. Freya requested beauty, but the fjords had eaten all the flowers. Offerings were improvised cheese wheels, crying fish, and occasionally a heartfelt poem scratched onto bark. Visions were rare and mostly misinterpreted. Bjorn once claimed a cloud resembled Freya's hair. Others saw a goat. The goat was insulted. Prophecies floated through the village like sleepy rumors. The end of the world was predicted weekly, usually postponed due to snow. Rituals of drowsy devotion, the ceremonial sacrifice, involved chanting while trying not to trip over your cloak. Participants hummed in harmony, sipping lukewarm ale, and occasionally falling asleep. The gods appreciated effort more than flair. Festivals were slow-burning, affairs dancing that resembled standing, songs that sounded like weather complaints, and spiritual speeches delivered by people who had never actually met a god but felt qualified anyway. Even death carried religious weight. Bodies were buried with combs, turnips, and heartfelt letters apologizing for minor personality flaws. Some were sent off in boats, which promptly sank in nearby puddles. Faith wasn't about certainty. It was about ritual, rhythm, and quietly hoping the gods wouldn't send another emotionally unstable bear into the village square. And so, by firelight and half-believed tales, Vikings clung to their myths, not for answers, but for something to whisper about before sleep returned, soft as moss, slow as time, and slightly scented with ceremonial goat. In the Viking world, social rank was a cloak you couldn't take off, even when it was damp, lopsided, or smelled faintly of salted despair. You were born into your place, wrapped in a burlap destiny, and told to accept it with the stoicism of a thrall attending a spoon-carving ceremony. The three flavors of Vikings came in three main flavors: thralls, the bottom rung; servants, captives, unpaid goat massage therapists. They slept near the oven and dreamed of slightly better straw; carls, the average folks; farmers, blacksmiths, goat poets. They had enough rights to argue about soup but not enough to avoid barn duty; jarls, the elites, fancy cloaks, emotional axes, and the right to sigh dramatically in public. They hosted feasts with 7 types of herring and controlled nearly all the village's decorative moss. Movement between ranks was possible, like trying to climb a ladder made of slippery fish. Occasionally, a thrall earned freedom by surviving 3 winters without crying audibly. Sometimes a carl became a jarl by marrying someone with an impressive collection of ceremonial turnips. Class tensions, relations between classes were polite, quiet, and dripping with passive resentment. Jarls nodded graciously at carls, who smiled back while internally critiquing the jarl's beard symmetry. Thralls were respected in theory, avoided in practice, and occasionally gifted expired cheese in honor of seasonal goodwill. Bjorn once tried to unite the classes with a communal fish stew. The jarls refused to eat with spoons carved by thralls. The carls argued about the broth's ethical implications, and a goat ate half the table. Seating arrangements of emotional weight at gatherings, status-determined seating. Jarls lounged near the fire on wolf-pelt cushions. Carls sat on damp benches. Thralls crouched politely in corners, pretending not to notice the goat judging their posture. One feast was ruined when a carl accidentally sat near the jarl's ceremonial chair. A trial ensued. It ended in goat-based reconciliation. Identity, insecurity, and Ichiwal Vikings didn't express ambition loudly. They wrote quiet poems about yearning and repressed their dreams with hay. Everyone wanted something slightly better. Warmer socks, more soup, fewer chores. Status wasn't everything, but it was a lot. Still, despite the rigid ranks and cold power dynamics, most Vikings ended up with similar fates: frostbitten feet, unspoken regrets, and a shared belief that goats had more freedom than anyone. And as they slept in uneven straw piles, warmed by vague prestige and the occasional sigh of upward mobility, one truth lingered in their dreams: social status was exhausting. Healing in the Viking Age was a delicate balance between hope and moss. There were no hospitals, just well-meaning elders with a collection of questionable roots and stories about magical berries that cured heartbreak but not toe fungus. If you were injured, which was highly likely given the amount of goat-related collisions and misunderstandings, you reported to Hilda the healer, a woman with 12 braids, 7 jars of disappointment, and a permanent squint that scanned wounds like judging soup consistency. Herbs, leeks, and wishful thinking. Most medicine was which meant treatment started with someone sprinting into a forest yelling, "I think this one looks medicinal." Common remedies included yarrow for bleeding. It also attracted confused bees. Willow bark, mild pain relief, plus a pleasant aftertaste of emotional repression. Leek poultices used on sprains, although it mostly made you smell like soup. If no plants worked, they deplace a warm stone near the wound and tell its stories until the infection got bored and left. The bloodletting debate: some believed that illness came from bad blood. The solution: let it out. This involves ceremonial poking, dramatic sighing, and a bowl that doubled as a raincatcher when not catching your essence. Vikings weren't squeamish. They just strongly disliked anything that made them dizzy. Bjorn once requested bloodletting for his seasonal sadness. Hilda accidentally treated the wrong leg. He claimed it worked anyway and started writing poetry about surgery. Surgery was rare, typically attempted with a knife, bravery, and no anesthesia. The most successful procedure involved removing a splinter with a comb blessed by Freya. The least successful involved replacing a missing tooth with decorative gravel. Pain was handled through distraction. People sang, drank, or stared at clouds until the agony felt poetic. Diagnoses that sounded like weather reports. Healers used phrases like, "Your humors are melting," or "The wind has confused your ankle." Diagnoses relied heavily on intuition, dreams, and whether the village goat licked you during check-in. No one understood germs. They blamed trolls, curses, or someone sneezing dramatically during the last feast. Recovery and emotional naps. Healing took weeks, during which the patient lay on straw, stared at beams, and re-evaluated every decision that led to goat trampling. Visitors brought broth, vague encouragement, and gossip about whose cow had recently betrayed them. Eventually, you healed or didn't. Either way, you received a ceremonial sigh and a new tunic stitched from modest optimism. Love in the Viking Age moved at the speed of erosion. Courtship was not passionate, it was cautious, chilly, and conducted entirely in sideways glances across turnip piles. Vikings didn't fall in love. They slowly tripped into it, apologized, and offered a hand-knit sock. Marriages were arranged by parents, neighbors, goats, or weather patterns. If two people happened to be standing near a fjord at the same time for 3 consecutive days, it was legally binding. Romance began with an exchange of fermented fish and ended with shared property disputes. Bjorn once wooed Ingrid by gifting her a comb made from melancholy ant. She accepted it, nodded solemnly, and they were considered emotionally fused. They only spoke twice, once about stew and once about existential dread. Flirtation in the age of mud. Flirting involves subtle gestures, staring meaningfully at someone's cloak hem, offering second helpings of lukewarm soup, sitting next to them during a thunderstorm and not mentioning the thunder. Love poems were short and mostly agricultural. One classic read: "Your goats are symmetrical, my heart weeps in the barn." If you wished to express deeper affection, you carved a spoon with their initials, or serenaded them with a breathy ballad while standing waist-deep in mist. The ceremony of underwhelming commitment. Weddings were practical affairs. Guests gathered, dressed in emotionally neutral colors, while the couple exchanged rings made of braided regret and scraps of linen. The feast included boiled roots, passive applause, and a ceremonial goat who looked unimpressed. There was dancing, though it mostly resembled standing near the fire and occasionally shifting weight between feet. Passion was implied, never confirmed. Intimacy and story-related barriers. Privacy didn't exist, so romance relied heavily on silence. Couples shared sleeping corners, straw mats, and goose feather pillows that poked at emotional boundaries. Intimacy happened in whispers, carefully synchronized to avoid disturbing nearby livestock. One couple famously fell in love by blinking in unison during a lightning storm. Their children grew up believing eye contact was a form of marriage proposal. Heartbreak, haiku, and goat rejection. Breakups occurred with dignity. One partner would move their stew bowl elsewhere. Another might return a comb with symbolic moss attached. Occasionally, goats refused to bless the union, an omen that guaranteed at least 5 seasons of emotional confusion. Bjorn was once left by Ingrid when she decided to marry her own personal ambition. He coped by writing haikus about weather and staring into puddles that resembled a stern expression. Vikings loved stories, but not the dramatic kind. Novies were tales, told slowly, carefully, with enough pauses to make the campfire consider early retirement. Sagas weren't meant to excite. They were meant to wrap listeners in the cozy fog of maybe I'm awake, maybe I'm dreaming of fish. The art of drowsy storytelling. Every village had a skald, a storyteller with a beard full of crumbs and metaphors. The skald sat near the hearth and recited the epics of old. Heroes who walked very far, stared meaningfully at clouds, and occasionally poked giants with caution. Tales were long, so long, in fact, that most listeners forgot what was happening by the middle and simply nodded politely until sleep claimed them. One popular saga, The Quest for the Ambivalent Raven, involved a warrior named Crumb who chased a bird across several seasons, only to have it insult his tunic and fly away. Another favorite, The turnip that knew too much concerned a root vegetable that overheard village gossip and became a respected advisor. Audience etiquette. Listening to sagas required posture. Slouching was preferred. Blank stares meant engagement. Interruptions, usually by sneezing goats or someone loudly chewing moss, were considered part of the experience. The best stories ended not with triumph, but with reflection. And so the hero gazed upon the fjord, a skald might whisper, and realized he was not thirsty, just lonely. At this point, everyone blinked slowly and agreed to sleep. Themes of sleepy grandeur sagas often explored important Viking values. Persistence, walking through fog for 13 chapters. Subtlety, expressing emotion through sock color. Ambiguity, ending the story with, or maybe it was all, a goat's dream. Bjorn once recited a saga so gently that listeners forgot who Bjorn was. Even the goats stopped chewing. Legacy in loops, sagas were passed down, altered slightly with each retelling. One version of the Night of 12 Blankets ended in a ceremonial nap. Another featured a warrior lost in thought for 5 years, during which he invented melancholic stew. These stories weren't meant to thrill, they were meant to settle the soul, to offer a slow exhale at the end of a cold day. And as the skald finished, voice like worn parchment and sighs stitched between syllables, the fire dimmed. Blankets rose, goats nodded. The saga had done its work. Sleep came like winter's breath. Viking children weren't raised. They were gently nudged into responsibility with a goat's disapproving glare. From the moment they stopped wobbling, they were expected to contribute to the great, slow grind of frostbitten survival. Toys. There weren't any. Instead, children played with sticks, rocks, and the concept of delayed emotional fulfillment. If a child shaped a stick to resemble a sword, they were immediately drafted into the family's mud defense team. Bjorn's youngest son, Canute, once asked what fun meant. Bjorn answered by handing him a bucket and pointing toward the barn's emotional leak. Morning duties. Greet the fog and scrub regret. Children woke with the Sunor, its gloomy cousin, the grey blur. They fed chickens who refused eye contact, collected eggs laid in existential despair, and milked goats who delivered harsh life advice. They swept, straw, tended turnips, and rubbed moss on places moss didn't belong. One task involved organizing rocks by how judgmental they appeared. A rite of passage required balancing on ice while herding sheep that actively resisted destiny. Education and the school of size, formal schooling, was rare. Wisdom passed from elders through slow anecdotes and disappointing riddles. What walks on for legs? Then leaves without explaining its feelings. Probably father. Children were taught to count via spoons, measure using goat lengths, and recite poetry that mostly involved metaphors about damp bread. Reading wasn't necessary, just knowing when someone was about to cry. Emotional growth via turn-up interaction. Empathy was developed by watching root vegetables rot. Conflict resolution involved sitting together in silence until someone apologized through soup placement. Sibling rivalry was expressed through passive broom wars and dramatic staring during meals. One child once rebelled by painting a smile on a rock. The community declared it too whimsical, and the rock was reassigned to duty guarding the ceremonial pond. Childhood leisure-free time meant wandering the fjords with questions, maybe carving a stick, maybe talking to a cloud. Hide-and-seek was hard since most hiding spots had already been claimed by goats. Some children pretended to be turnips just to feel missed. Sleep was a reward, a long nap beneath wool, with dreams of slightly warmer stew and goats that understood complex emotions. Death in the Viking Age wasn't greeted with wailing or dramatic lightning strikes. No, when someone passed, the village responded with muted nods, downcast goat glances, and a gentle agreement that things were now slightly colder than before. The funeral began at sunrise, or whatever blur of light passed for it. Villagers gathered around the deceased, who was dressed in their finest tunic, the one with the fewest soup stains, and, laid gently upon a slab, smelled of ceremonial turnip. Bjorn once attended 7 funerals in a month. By the 5th, he mistook one for a birthday and brought moss biscuits. No one corrected him. The deceased probably wouldn't have minded. Rituals of mild significance. The body was washed in fjord water, then dried with emotional wind. Prayers were whispered long, winding sentences that mostly involved hoping the dead remembered to return borrowed items before ascending to Valhalla. A goat wandered by, inspecting the body for spiritual readiness. If the goat sneezed, It was taken as a sign of safe passage. Offerings were placed alongside the departed. Spoons carved with mild affection, bread that was mostly air, and one sock. The ceremony of sluggish departure. Some were buried in boats. The boat was pulled to the water by sleepy volunteers, then gently nudged forward until it either sailed majestically or got stuck in mud and was quietly abandoned. Others received standard graves, dug with scythes and dull shovels. The tombstone was optional, often replaced by a rock with personality in the inscription. They tried. Bjorn once delivered a eulogy for a sheep. His speech included 3 pauses, 2 poems, and a mid-sentence nap. Post-funeral feast, a meal was shared after. It featured stew so bland it made people reflective. Conversations turned to legacy, inheritance, and whether ghosts appreciate proper seasoning. Laughter was discouraged unless it involved remembering the time the deceased fell into turnip stew and blamed the weather. Grief in foggy doses. Mourning lasted days, sometimes weeks. People walked slower, nodded longer, refused to engage with goats named after the departed. Eventually, grief faded into the background hum of cold wind and unbaked bread. Death wasn't shocking, it was part of the rhythm, an offbeat moment in the lullaby of Viking life. And at the end, villagers returned home, wrapped in wool, slightly sad, mostly sleepy. The goat sighed, and time exhaled. To ride a Viking longship was to enroll in a course titled How to Be Wet Forever, an introduction. These narrow, dragon-headed boats were sleek, swift, and wildly uncomfortable. They cut across choppy seas like determined bread knives, leaving sailors behind with salt-crusted eyebrows and a disintegrating sense of optimism. Bjorn once described sailing as floating atop a sarcastic puddle while regret tickled your knees. Others agreed, nodding solemnly between a journey of shared dampness. Rowing wasn't a skill, it was a curse, shared by every Viking with elbows. 30 warriors packed into a long ship, rowing in awkward unison while trying not to make eye contact with the one guy who always forgot the rhythm. The sea slapped the sides. The wind mocked hairstyles. Fish stared up from the depths with judgmental bubbles. Cabin conditions. There were no cabins, just planks, and dreams of planks that weren't as splintery. Sailors sat, stood, and slept wherever their knees failed. Blankets were damp. Boots were emotionally soggy. Privacy was an illusion. A goat named Snorri once watched Bjorn sleep for 6 hours with troubling intensity. Toilets, the sea, hygiene, a hopeful glance at the horizon, entertainment in the abyss to pass the time. Sailors told stories, mostly bad ones. A favorite involved a haunted spoon and a jealous trout. Singing was common, but off-key, and usually interrupted by someone coughing seaweed. Occasionally, warriors played Guess the Smell, which was quickly banned, raiding arrival disappointments after weeks of rowing and mutual foot-sniffing. The longship arrived. Land, riches, glory, except the shore was full of rocks. The village had already been raided, and someone dropped the ceremonial goat. Vikings disembarked with stiff backs and philosophical frowns. Raiding was exhausting. Sometimes they just knocked on doors and asked politely for soup. One raid ended when Bjorn tripped, spilled his axe, and convinced the enemy he was cursed. They gave him a chair and some berries. The return trip, now wetter, returning home, was even worse. Sails tore, morale frayed. Someone accidentally summoned fog through experimental humming, and still the longship creaked forward, filled with warriors pretending to admire clouds while contemplating retirement. At last, the village came into view, a welcome sit except it was raining. Again, Vikings stepped onto muddy earth, with splinters in their soles and seaweed in their underwear, and yet they survived. Again, sleep came quickly that night. Bjorn dreamt of land and goats that didn't watch you blink. In Viking society, skalds were revered as keepers of stories, weavers of history, and part-time therapists for emotionally disoriented goats. Their poems didn't stir hearts, they gently nudged them toward contemplation, like a spoon dipping into lukewarm broth. Poetry was not explosive. It was careful, slow, and often delivered while one's audience chewed roots with quiet disinterest. The skald sat near the hearth, staring at a cracked mug or a cloud that resembled lost ambition, and murmured verses so somber they once caused a turnip to wilt. Bjorn tried to be his poem about fog was so abstract that villagers thought he'd gone missing inside his own metaphor. He hadn't. He was behind a goat, rhyming with moss. What a skald actually said Skaldic verse was rich in meaning but low in volume. It often sounded like this. Lo, the fjord gazed back, ... and said nothing. I, too, remained soup. Villagers nodded. One cried softly, unsure why. Topics of importance skalds rarely addressed. Glory they preferred, whether preferably fog. Relationships, especially when defined by awkward pauses. The internal life of spoons. One famous skald once wrote 30 lines about a sheep refusing eye contact. It was considered prophetic. Performance style. Glacial enthusiasm poems were recited slowly, not by choice, but by tradition. Every line floated through the smoke of the hearth, mingled with goat hair, and landed softly on the straw below. Audiences responded with humming, blinking, or respectful dozing. Interruptions were welcome. If someone sneezed mid-verse, the skald incorporated it as symbolism. Bjorn once performed while sitting inside a barrel. He claimed it heightened emotional resonance. The audience disagreed but remained supportive through mild clapping. Legacy. Words that drift. The power of a skald's poem wasn't in its rhyme. It was in its ability to love, to soothe, to paint a picture so vague and beautiful that even the wind paused to listen. And when night fell, and goats curled beneath half-written stanzas, the village slept not with peace, but with quiet curiosity. Bjorn whispered his final verse into the flickering fire. May your dreams be vague and slightly damp. Then silence, and straw-cradled sleep. If Viking life demanded survival, then crafting was its reluctant sidekick, a slow tango between stubborn materials and emotionally exhausted fingers. Tools weren't forged with precision. They were coerced into shape via mild insults and repetitive hammering. Artisans weren't celebrated. They were quietly pitied, mostly by goats who chewed on their half-finished projects with artistic contempt. Bjorn once tried to carve a comb. It looked like a haunted centipede, and was later repurposed as a storytelling device in a poem about emotional weather. Woodworking. While your hands hate you, every Viking village needed wooden bowls, shields, furniture, and the occasional abstract goat sculpture. Wood, however, resisted. It splintered, it cracked, it screamed emotionally in the form of knots no chisel could decipher. Craftsmen like Egil the Unfulfilled spent days shaving planks into usefulness. Each stroke whispered despair. Nails were rare and bent after 3 uses. Sawdust coated the floors, the hair, the food, the dreams, and always a nearby goat judged silently. Metalwork, fire, and mild sobbery blacksmiths forged swords, hinges, and emotionally confused buck. They worked beside forges that belched smoke, glowed with resentment, and occasionally spoke in the form of hissed sparks. The iron refused to behave. It twisted like scandal, refused symmetrical curves, and once melted into what scholars later confirmed was a rude shape. Bjorn attempted to make a ladle for his anniversary. It resembled a depressed mushroom. His wife used it anyway, because love in Viking lands was patient and deeply ironic. Textiles and emotional thread-spinning yarn involved taming wool and asking it kindly not to fight back. Cloth was itchy, often wet, and had the durability of slightly committed moss. Patterns were meaningful. A zigzag suggested "don't talk to me." Circles meant goat drama imminent. Embroidery captured family lineage, seasonal regrets, and one known case of political disagreement over soup placement. Needles bent, fingers bled, but garments were made, and when Vikings wore them proudly, they looked like abstract paintings trapped in frost. Rope, baskets, and other crying projects. Other crafts involved weaving twigs into baskets that immediately collapsed. Making rope required cursing gently and braiding disappointment. Bjorn once created a hammock that subtly suggested "don't trust this." Decorative items were rare, but occasionally one brave soul carved a smiling sun on a stool. The stool broke. The symbolism was profound. The splinter as a metaphor to be a Viking artisan was to endure, to create knowing it might collapse, to carve something imperfect because frost was coming and goats needed something to ignore. And as the work wound down, and hands throbbed beneath woolen regret, sleep arrived like a final coat of moss varnish. Bjorn wiped sweat from his brow, admired his lopsided spoon, and whispered, "It will do." Hygiene during the Viking Age was both communal and slightly traumatic. Cleanliness was valued, but only in the way people value polite goats. Useful, confusing, and occasionally intimidating. Bathing happened once a week, usually on Logadag, or bath day, which loosely translates to hope your toes survive. The bathhouse was a smoky, steamy shack nestled beside a stream that howled like an abandoned flute. Steam rose slowly from heated rocks, mingling with awkward small talk and the scent of old moss. The water was either scalding or glacial. Bjorn described the temperature as motivational, meaning it inspired you to question life decisions and scream internally. Communal soaking, unspoken rules. Vikings didn't bathe alone. That was suspicious. Groups gathered, stripped politely, and sank into lukewarm bliss while pretending the water wasn't chewing on their dignity. Conversation topics included cloud shapes, the proper angle for spoon carving, emotional confessions from goats. No one splashed. Splashing implied rebellion. Steam etiquette was sacred, never outshine the village elders' fog aura. Seasonal suffering in winter. Water froze into philosophical statements. To bathe required cracking ice, apologizing to your feet, and dunking yourself with the grace of a collapsing moose. Bjorn once attempted a snow bath, claiming it was He emerged looking like a salted fish with mild regrets. Spring brought mud, summer, biting bugs. Autumn was considered best for bathing, which just meant fewer geese interrupted the experience. Viking soap and its disappointments. Soap was made from ash fat and crushed dreams. It smelled earthy and felt like betrayal. Lathering was optional. Scrubbing involved moss, an existential staring at your own elbows. Drying off meant wrapping in wool and sitting by the fire until your skin stopped making statements. Goat participation and judgment occasionally. Goats wandered into the bathhouse seeking warmth. If they chose to sit near you, it was seen as a blessing. If they chewed your towel, a challenge. One goat, named Mistield, became a bathing mascot after rescuing a wayward tunic during a windstorm. Cleanliness leads to drowsiness after bathing. Vikings returned home with skin slightly less itchy, hair vaguely shaped, and spirits lifted like a shrug. Warm, clean, and emotionally soft, they wrapped themselves in straw and dreamt of rivers that didn't judge. Bjorn, freshly bathed and mildly steaming, sighed. For a moment, I am soup. Migration in Viking times was rarely about adventure. It was mostly about running out of usable rocks, arguing with neighbors over turnip boundaries, and convincing yourself that the next fjord wouldn't smell like damp moss. Explorers set sail with hope in one hand, fermented bread in the other, and an overwhelming uncertainty tucked beneath their slightly itchy cloaks. Bjorn once declared, "I seek new horizons." His goat nodded solemnly, then ate his map. Sailing toward slightly worse conditions, new lands were promised by squalls and dreams, rich soil, friendly skies, no judgmental goats. Instead, voyagers found colder rocks, larger birds, with attitude mud that whispered unflattering things about their boots. Greenland was a lie. It was mostly white. Vinland had berries, but they were suspiciously philosophical. Every island came with a slight sense of betrayal. Wildlife that didn't care. Foreign animals greeted migrants with emotional distance. Walruses blinked slowly, radiating passive resistance. Foxes mocked their farming skills. One raven followed Bjorn for 2 weeks, offering unsolicited critiques on his walking posture. Goats back home at least made eye contact. Settlement squabbles, building new homes required wood, patience, and pretending the wind wasn't insulting your structural choices. Tents collapsed mid-toast. Fires refused to warm emotional wounds. The soil rejected seeds like an overprotective aunt, rejecting suitors. Disagreements over stew recipes nearly led to a Bjorn, in charge of morale, accidentally insulted the sun and was voted least likely to inspire optimism. Culture shock and puddle-shaped. Regret migrants missed their old weather. Familiar insults and the comforting sigh of the village goat. They tried to teach local birds Viking etiquette. The birds threw berries at them. Language barriers were real. One Viking attempted diplomacy with locals using interpretive spoon dance. It was not effective. The long nap of realization eventually, the migrants accepted their fate. New lands were not better, just different in their disappointment. Still, the sun occasionally sparkled. A patch of grass might pretend to be fertile, and the walrus might wink, implying some vague, emotional alliance. They unpacked slowly. Sleep returned like a soft surrender, carrying dreams of home of long houses, of predictable drizzle, of goats who understood nuance. Bjorn, curled beside a ceremonial turnip, whispered, "Far or near, life remains mostly damp." Sleep in the Viking age wasn't restful. It was negotiated. Between straw pokes, drafty walls, and the occasional goat whispering secrets near your elbow. Rest arrived, not as a gift, but a transaction. You gave up expectations, and in return, received mild unconsciousness punctuated by itching. Beds weren't constructed. They were designated areas. A pile of straw in the corner, a plank with emotional history, a blanket shared between 2.5 people. Privacy was mythical, and snoring was considered community bonding. Bjorn's sleeping space was wedged between a barrel and a pile of melancholy. He called it the nest of regret. His dreams smelled faintly of soup. Goat interference and blanket politics. Goats roamed freely, occasionally joining sleepers without consent. If a goat laid beside you, it meant you were respected. If it chewed your pillow, you had offended local spirituality. Blankets were distributed by status, size, and whether you'd cried recently. They never fit properly. Most had mysterious holes shaped like bad decisions. One night, Ingrid discovered her blanket had been stolen by an ambitious chicken. She stared into the fire and composed a poem about betrayal and feet. Straw, a cushion of many opinions. Straw was both mattress and nemesis. It shifted, it jabbed, it whispered softly when the wind leaned in. Villagers occasionally arranged patterns in their bedding, hoping it would manifest better dreams. It didn't. Mostly it summoned mild back pain and the scent of old cabbage. Bjorn once claimed his straw pokes matched the rhythm of Odin's disappointment. Dreams of mild adventure sleep, when achieved, brought dreams that hovered between memory and goat logic. Visions of walking too far, of stew that never cooled, of clouds shaped like emotional axes. Some villagers practiced dream control by eating specific roots before bed. Results included floating goats, spoon duels, and one disturbing prophecy involving damp socks. Upon waking, no one shared dreams aloud. They nodded politely and moved toward the day's disappointments. The morning shuffle. Morning didn't begin with light. It began with someone groaning, a goat sighing, and the fire reasserting its presence. Vikings stretched, scratched, and reaffirmed their commitment to mild survival. Bjorn rose from his straw nest and declared, "I feel refreshed in theory." The stone wasn't smooth, it was temperamental. Soap was not involved. Water was added sparingly, mostly for dramatic effect. Some used spit, others used snow. Bjorn used melted cheese once. It didn't help, but it felt personal. Positioning mattered. A crooked angle could ruin your weakened reputation. Elders spoke of the angle of purpose exactly, 23.4 degrees, unless you had recently endured heartbreak, in which case it was flexible. Goats watched nearby, occasionally nodding when bevel symmetry matched their aesthetic standards. The circular nature of doubt's sharpening invited reflection. Is my life a blade dulled by tasks I never chose? Do I even need an axe? What if I pursued spoon carving instead? Bjorn once paused mid-hone to stare at a cloud that resembled his childhood ambitions. He continued sharpening, slower than before. Every burr removed from the blade felt like peeling away denial. Every glint of polished steel revealed a truth too sharp to grasp. The philosophy of the grind Vikings believed in the three edges. The outer edge, for chopping wood and interrupting stew parties. The inner edge, for knowing when to stop chopping. The hidden edge, for slicing through existential fog. Some argued there was a fourth edge, but it turned out to be a dent caused by Bjorn tripping over goose tracks. The sleepy resolution, after hours of scraping, sighing, and staring into puddles of introspection, Bjorn finished. His axe gleamed it not with perfection, but quiet honesty. He touched the blade, nodded once, then wrapped it in moss to keep the metaphor alive. The axe was ready, or perhaps it was finally tired of trying. Bjorn closed his eyes, muttering, sharp enough to be misunderstood, and slept, right there beside the river, beneath the weight of steel and his gently sharpened self. Winter in Viking lands didn't simply happen. It became everything. It crept into bones, tucked itself into sentences, and rewrote the village's sense of hope into a slow, icy shrug. Snow blanketed the ground in quiet judgment. Ice formed opinions on windows. Even the sun peeked over the horizon and immediately Bjorn stood at the edge of the fjord, staring into the white void. He whispered, "So, it begins again." A raven sneezed somewhere in agreement. The sky forgets. Warmth the sun flickered like indecision. Morning was mostly clouds hung heavy, shaped like depressed goats. Wind howled through longhouses with the tone of unpaid emotional debts. Frost became decorative. It crowned turnips. It traced sad poetry onto shields. Every surface glittered like it was trying too hard to distract from the despair beneath. Villager behavior in permafrost movement slowed. Conversations shortened. People wore so many layers they resembled sentient quilts. Blankets were hoarded. Socks were bartered. One villager wore a fur cloak so dense it was classified as a personality. Cooking ceased to be creative. It reverted to heat something beige and hope for nutrients. The stew pot doubled as a hand warmer and occasional confession booth. Bjorn attempted winter cheer by offering hot moss tea. Reactions were varied. One goat fainted. Tasks become allegorical. Wood chopping became a metaphor for emotional resilience. Path clearing turned into philosophical performance art. Snow removal became known as the endless undoing. Egil spent 3 days carving a tunnel through drift. He emerged, blinking, only to realize he'd tunneled into his own long house from a different angle. It was declared symbolic. Children played with icicles and deep questions. One crafted a snow fort titled A Fortress Against My Feelings. Prophecies of mild concern winter brought dreams. Ominous, vague dreams. Sagas spoke of endless frost of sleeping rivers, of wolves with bachelor's degrees, of nights so long the stars asked for vacation time. Bjorn received a vision. A goat wearing mittens, standing on the moon, whispering it never ends. The village took this seriously and added mittens to their ceremonial inventory. Sleeper's survival when tasks slowed and stew ran out of adjectives. Vikings slept, long, dreamless sleeps wrapped in layers of wool, moss, and quiet surrender. Snoring became spiritual. Blankets became confessionals. One pair of boots was repurposed into a nap shrine, and in the frost-thick silence, Bjorn murmured, "Winter is the truth we never asked for, but always felt in our socks."